To start off today, I'm going to tell a story. When I was a young faculty member, fresh off my PhD, one of the things I was doing was going around and talking to horse owners. And one of my favorite things to do was a hay demonstration. And at this particular meeting, there was around 200 horse owners in the stands at a local arena. And I always love to bring samples of hay and discuss, why forage was so critical to the horse and their diet. And one of the things I always loved to do was I would grab a flake of grass hay and a flake of alfalfa hay, the legume hay, and just show the differences in weight. Because I always talked about we need to feed our horses by weight, not volume, and weighing out the different flakes of hay to show them, sometimes we're overestimating or underestimating the weights of these flakes of hay. The next thing I loved to do was bring different samples of hay and talk about the nutrients in them. And on this particular day, I had some green hay. It was greener, so it was cut earlier and had not dried out as much as the hay next to it, which was a little bit more yellow. And obviously, the 200 people couldn't touch, smell the hay, but just visually appraising the hay. And I talked about the differences and I asked them, which hay would you choose from your horse just looking at it? And a lot of them pointed to that greener looking grass hay. And I told them this hay that looks a little bit older, a little bit aged or yellower, actually had more nutrients in it than the greener looking hay. Now, to jump forward a little bit, that greener hay was more mature. So it was an average mature hay, where that yellower hay was actually a earlier cut hay. So it had more nutrients in it. After we were done, at the end of our talks, this wonderful little old lady, close to probably 80 years old, walked up to me. And she pointed to the green hay and said, I would still give that to my horse. And I smiled at her and understood, she's probably been in the horse industry since she was a little girl. And I said, yes, but if I showed you the hay tests and the nutrient content of that hay, could I change your mind? And she smiled and said, maybe. And she walked off. As a young educator, I realized you can't convince everybody all the time, but it did instill in me how critical it is to also teach about hay tests and how that information is so important to your horse. That story is one of those that's always stuck with me throughout my career in how we misunderstand sometimes when we're choosing forages for our animals. And when you visually appraise a hay, you have to look at more than just the color. And we purposely did that where we had some greener, older hay versus a earlier cut, more nutritious hay, but that has been seasoned, right? Drier. So it had a little bit more yellowish to it. Just to tell people, look, you can go and visually appraise hay, but unless you do a hay test, you really are not knowing what nutrients are in there, because forage is the foundation of every horse's diet. That's what they eat the most of. That's where they're getting a lot of their nutrients, their energy, their protein, those essential amino acids, and then some non-structural carbohydrates, which we're going to talk about, and other nutrients, they're minerals. But there are gaps, and I'm going to explain that here, because wherever you go in the world, whether you're in Australia or you jump up to Mongolia or go all to North America, South America, Europe, it does not matter where you live. There is not a forage on the planet that is going to have all the nutrients that the horse needs each day. There may be some magical forage somewhere. We just don't know where that is. Where the vast majority of the 60 million domestic horses get their forage, whether it's pasture or hay, when they are grazing or eating that hay, there are gaps in nutrients. So to start this off and give you an example, what nutrients are in that hay, or even where that pasture's growing, but we're going to stick to this discussion mainly about hay. What nutrients are in that soil are going to determine what nutrients are in that plant. So to give you an example, and I'm going to go to the United States because that's where I grew up and did a lot of these talks. And let's go to Washington State, where they grow a lot of alfalfa, right? That is shipped throughout the US. And I remember when I was in the Southeast United States, whether it was South Carolina or Florida, and we got alfalfa in, usually it was from the Pacific Northwest, Colorado, maybe New Mexico, because alfalfa did not grow well in that hot, humid climate of, say, Florida. So in this example, let's say we're getting alfalfa from Washington State versus alfalfa grown in Colorado. Okay, so it's a state in the western United States. They grow a lot of alfalfa there too, not too far apart. Well, in Washington State, those soils are deficient in the critical mineral selenium. Selenium is one of those minerals that horse owners are probably pretty familiar with because we have a lot of deficient soils of selenium. So as you imagine, as that plant grows and there's, say, no selenium in the soil, well, there's going to be no selenium in that plant. Or if there's very little selenium in the soil, there's going to be very little selenium in that plant. So when we cut it, cure it, bale it, and feed it to our horses, they're not going to get the selenium they need each and every day. And again, critical antioxidant for healthy physiology in the horse. Now, Colorado generally has sufficient selenium in the soil. So the alfalfa growing there will uptake that selenium in the plant. You cut it, feed it to your horse, and they're getting their selenium, or close to it probably, for what they need. So then you go, okay, well, I'll just source my hay from Colorado. Well, Colorado soils can be low in zinc. That's critical for just our hooves of our horse. That's just hooves and healthy coat and all of that. But zinc's high in your Washington soils. So you can't just go, well, this is a hay from this part of the country or wherever you live in the world that's going to have every single nutrient in it. And I'm just trying to demonstrate to you that it does not matter where your hay's grown. It's going to be deficient in some of these micronutrients like the zincs or the seleniums or all the others. Also, hays or forages are going to be low or devoid of vitamins. So what does that mean? That means we have to supplement that somewhere in the horse's diet, right? So that's why we supplemental feed them either with bagged feed, or what's highly recommended today is just a vitamin mineral mix. Start there. Then you can add things that the horse might need in their diet if they need more energy because they're athletes or competing, things like that. This is also why you probably want to speak with an equine nutritionist, because they can help you balance the diet. But getting back to hay testing, that is why it is very important that you test your hay often. And I'll explain a little bit later what that means, so you know the nutrient content. And there's other reasons to do that. And that, again, goes to your pastures too, because if my horses are grazing in Colorado, great, they're getting selenium, but they're not getting the zinc they need. Or if my horse is grazing in Washington State, they're getting plenty of zinc, but not enough selenium. So that is where your equine nutritionist comes in. And that's why the equine feed industry, supplement industry is worth billions around the planet, because we know you can't just feed a horse only forage and meet all of their nutrient needs. Whether that horse is just out there as a companion animal, never ridden, or doesn't ride anymore, is retired, any of that, from the maintenance diet all the way to our top elite athletes, they need supplemental either feed or supplements like a vitamin mineral mix. Now, some of you may go, what about wild horses? I mean, they're fine, right? Out in the wild, horses range far and wide, and their diets are not just, say, a forage. They will eat other things to try to make up some of those imbalances that they're getting from the grass. Also, horses in the wild don't live as long as our domestic companion horses. We know that on average, 8 years, depending on the study you look at. I know there's the exception. Some of these wild horses can live into their 30s. And again, they probably have wonderful diets and wonderful sources of nutrients around them. But when you look around the world, these feral or wild horses, their lives are a lot shorter, and they are not putting humans on their back or pulling carts or doing these things that we ask of them. Right. So keep that in mind, that we're asking horses to do a lot more work generally, which is going to change their nutrient needs. And we're also keeping them confined to an area where we're either giving them hay or giving them pastures on, letting them forage on pastures or paddocks wherever you live in the world. This is where that hay test comes in, because that is going to give you the information you need to balance your horse's diet. And we're going to go through how to get a hay test done and what it tells you. But when you're looking at balancing a horse's diet, like, what about energy or calories? One of the things we talked about in this podcast previously is we tend to overfeed our horses. They get too much energy in the diet. We do have an obesity epidemic around the world with our horses where they are overconditioned. And that's leading to things like metabolic syndrome, joint issues, shorter lifespans, even though they're living longer in general because we're feeding them better. But if we overfeed them, that can shorten their lives. So energy is a big one. How much energy is in that hay? Because that is the majority of where the horse is getting their calories each and every day. Protein. We overfeed protein. And in general, most horses are going to get their protein needs met with their hay. Now, if you take an average quality hay, it's going to be a little bit lower in protein, but let's go to that nutrient dense hay. Let's say an alfalfa Timothy mix, it's going to be high in protein. Now, for some of you, have you ever walked into your horse's stall and then that pungent ammonia just smacks you in the face? Their urine is really, really pungent. Just that woof. And I've been in many stalls where it's just like, wow, that urine really stinks. It's really high in ammonia. Generally, that's because you're feeding too much protein to your horses. And when I used to go around talking to horse owners, I would say, what's your protein? Because when we talked about bag feeds back in the day, it was like, well, are you feeding a 12% feed or a 14% feed or an 18% feed? And when we said percent, that was meaning how much protein was in that feed. Today, we're a little bit more wiser where we know horses don't need that much protein. Okay. Then these other nutrients, like I said, the minerals, that's a huge one with our hays. And then the vitamins. We know hay is devoid or very low in some critical vitamins. And the mineral content is going to vary depending on where that hay was sourced from, where it was grown. Because hay grown in, let's say, Queensland, Australia, is going to differ from hay grown near Toronto, Canada. The mineral content's going to differ, even though they're the same species of Timothy grass. The mineral content is going to differ because of the soils. So again, that's where that vitamin mineral mix comes in to cover those gaps, where you have gaps in vitamins and minerals. And that's why every horse in the world should have some supplemental feed, at minimum a vitamin mineral mix. That way you're ensuring you're meeting all their needs. So like I said, Colorado, zinc; Washington State, selenium. Okay, looking at hay tests, here's some good news. Can be relatively inexpensive. Now, some hay tests are really cheap. So back where I used to be a professor at the University of Florida at our Forage extension lab, it's $7 per sample. Now, that's just giving you some very basics. And to look at a full profile, you probably want to add on things like looking at the minerals in the hay. So that can get a little bit pricier, get up to, say, maybe the $50 range. And I'm talking in US dollars. So it depends on where you live and the lab that's doing it. Okay, but it can be relatively inexpensive, in especially the grand scheme of things, that you're going to be balancing your horse's diets. And we tend to overfeed our horses. So we tend to spend more than we need to. Because if I'm, say, feeding a high quality bagged feed that's $30 US, and the horse goes through it over a period of few days, and I'm spending 100, some people spend $200 more just in supplemental feed, because they're like, oh, it needs a hoof supplement, needs this supplement, needs that supplement, when really you need to look at the hay first, find those gaps, and then just a good vitamin mineral mix. And then maybe you can add some things if you're an athlete, like electrolytes. It's not as difficult to balance a horse's diet today than, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And again, this is where an equine nutritionist can come in and help you. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But if you're overfeeding your horse and you cut back, well, it doesn't need this expensive bagged feed. Maybe, I can just, instead of spending $200 a month, I'll just spend $50 a month on a vitamin mineral mix. And my horse is covered. I have great quality hay. I've got all their calorie needs met. I've got all their protein needs met. Got some gaps here I'm going to fill, and my horse is doing great. Okay. Especially if your horse is overweight. This is again where you want to know what the energy is in that hay, because maybe you are feeding too good of a quality hay, that nutrient dense hay, or just say you just get wonderful, wonderful hay, and you're giving them as much as they want every day, and they're gaining weight like crazy, and you're like, oh, what can I do? Well, if you can't switch hays, you can start limit feeding that horse. Put it, you know, feed them smaller meals throughout the day, or put them in a hay net to slow them down. There's different strategies, right? But again, this is where that hay test starts that process of, okay, how am I going to balance this horse's diet? All right. So that's the good stuff with hay tests. Now, the bad news: takes time. Could be a few days up to 2 weeks. So if you have some immediate issues, your veterinarian, all of a sudden your horse is a metabolic horse, and your veterinarian's telling you got to watch what you're feeding with your hay, and you're frazzled, and we've all been there with our horses. Just be aware. That's why you want to test your hay often, and I'll explain that in a little bit. Not if you get a shipment of hay and you do a hay test, you don't have to go back next week and test it again. I'm saying when you get a new shipment in, especially when you source hay from somewhere else, or the hay comes, say, from, especially when I was living in Florida. Let's say our hay came from Georgia, which sometimes they grew some wonderful hay there. Or we got some hay from Texas. 2 different areas in the United States where that hay was grown, 2 totally different sources of nutrients. We needed to know what was in that. Okay. Because it's going to vary from even bale to bale. So I'll talk about taking a hay sample because you don't want to just sample one bale and then vary from load to load. So that's where that hay test can be a little bit frustrating for you because the quality is inconsistent. And you test it once, you're like, okay, great, I got the information, but it's going to change the next time you get a new shipment in, and you have to do it again and again. But that's what you budget for. And again, that's why they're not hundreds of dollars. They're relatively can be inexpensive. Now, before we get to what a hay test tell you, where do you go? So where do I even think about sending a hay sample? Well, very easy, quick internet search of hay tests near me will bring up a list of services. Now, I know I have listeners or viewers all over the world, and most horse friendly countries are going to have laboratories that are doing hay tests. So, whether you're in Canada, the United States, Mexico, Brazil, Europe, obviously they'll be there, down in Oceania, around the world, there are laboratories doing hay tests because that's also really important for ruminant nutrition. So, for cattle and sheep, and those owners need to know what's in their hay because that helps them balance their feed. So there are services around there, and you can look, and there's different services. Some places in the United States, there's multiple laboratories doing this. Now, if you are having trouble, just to plug this here, and you're in North America, you can go to madbarn.com, click Analyze Diet, and you can speak with one of our qualified nutritionists. It's a free service, no strings attached. They can help you get a hay test and then help you analyze your hay test, all for free. So if you're in North America and have not done that yet, I highly suggest you do. It's a wonderful part of being Mad Barn, and it is one of the services they offer. So check that out. But if you're outside North America, you can look for qualified equine nutritionists in your area and see what their services are and if there's costs involved. But I highly suggest it. I absolutely, especially if you, for any horse, really. Now, when you do find a laboratory, you want to go and read off their website, and most are going to have directions on what to do, how to properly get a hay sample, and how to ship it or where to ship it. So I just went to the University of Florida Forage Extension Laboratory, and for the $7 hay test, they're just giving you the crude protein and total digestible nutrients. You can contact them via phone or email if you want to get a horse quality test, or if you need to look at the mineral content, which I highly suggest you do. But it shows you where you mail it, how to take the samples, and how much. Now, this is critical. Getting that hay sample, that's a very, very important part of this process. It's not just you identify the laboratory where you're going to send your hay test. Then you need to know how to take a proper sample of your hay. Now, again, plugging Mad Barn because this is all free education for you and free demonstrations. On the website, there is how to take a hay sample for your horse by one of our PhD nutritionists, and she walks you through on how to do it with a hay bale core, or also using scissors. So when you are looking, if you do have that hay probe to get a core sample, many you can put on the end of an electric drill. There's other types out there. And she talks about going about 18 inches into the side of that bale of hay to get multiple flakes tested. So it's not just going to one specific part. You're going through the side, you're getting multiple flakes. So you're getting a representative sample of that bale of hay. And you want at least 10 to 12, upwards of 20 bales sampled. The total weight of the samples that you send should be half to a pound, or that's 200 to 500 grams. And when you go use your hay probe or core, you go in and then you take that sample, put it in a plastic baggie. And then once you go and do it all, you want to mix it. You want to mix it in that bag so it's representative of all the hay. If you have round bales, you want to go in at one of the curves to get a good sample. And again, go and do multiple samples. Okay, let's say I don't have a hay probe. What can I use? Well, you can use scissors. And this one you can do about 20 bales, and you want to go just grab different subsamples. So you get a few from the outside, but more you want to open up that hay and just grab it and then clip it at the end. So it's about 2 to 3 inch long segments, and stick it in your bag. And then go through your hay and do about 20 different bales of hay. Just grab, clip them, and stick it in the bag. So again, mix it at the end. Now you can sample pastures, which is again highly recommended, especially if that's where your horse gets a lot of their forage. How do you do that? Well, you can go around with scissors, and about every 10 feet, or that's about 3 meters, you want to clip the grass or the forage about where the horse is grazing. And you just clip it just like you're grabbing the hay sample, and you want 2 to 3 inch segments, and then you stick it in your bag. Now, depending on the laboratory, you can either freeze that, or you have to dry it out, which you can lay it out for a couple days and air dry it and then send it in. Okay, because again, you want to preserve the sugars that are in that sample, so it's representative when you get your pasture test. All right. Now, depending on the lab, they will offer like horse or sample analysis, and then you want to get that complete trace mineral analysis. And again, it's going to depend on the lab on what exactly they're going to be testing. But there are some generalities that I'll talk through, and then some of the things that might be missing. Okay, so you get your sample, it's bagged up, you mail it off, and then let's say within a week, you get your results. You are going to get back the sample test, which is a lot of numbers and some words that you're like, what is this? And that's where we're going to talk about right now. Because when you look at it, your eyes cross and you're like, okay, what is soluble protein percentage? Like what? And what is ADF, NDF, and all of that? Again, qualified equine nutritionists, they're the ones that decipher this. I remember, one of my favorite stories was back in my PhD years, and one of my really good friends, Dr. Clay Cavender, he's a professor now at University of Mississippi State. And we were taking classes on reproductive technologies. And these were the top scientists in the world: Dr. Mark Westhuizen, Dr. Katrin Hinrichs, Dr. Dewey Kramer, that were teaching us. And every time we went to lecture and lab, like we were just captured. It was so amazing. I mean, I'm working with the top cloners in the world. The Discovery Channel had just rolled through the lab, interviewing them because this was during the cloning craze. And I remember Clay and I got back to the grad office where all the PhDs were. And now Dr. Betsy Wagner, again, she said, "Oh, what class did you guys just get out of?" And we're like, "Oh yeah, reproductive technologies. Today we were talking about blah, blah, blah." And she's like, "Oh yeah, I just got out of analytical mineral biochemistry." And my eyes glazed over. I was like, "What?" I was like laughing. I'm like, "Oh, Betsy, that sounds so horrible." Here we are working with like elephant oocytes. And I remember lion oocytes. We were working with so much cool stuff. And she just got out of mineral biochemistry. But that's what she did for her PhD. And she's very wise in all of this. So again, like with Mad Barn, all these qualified PhD nutritionists, they just study this and study it. And then these are the people that are turning around, many of my mentors and many of my colleagues and friends. They publish the research, and then they put together the NRC, and they come out with the recommendations of what you should be feeding your horse. So feel good about that you have some very, very, very smart people and dedicated people coming up with all of this information, right? And I came out with reproductive physiology, and then I started to do some nutritional research too, because that's where it is. I mean, most of our horse research is centered around nutrition. So go back to this hay test and you look at these values. There are things you can do to look at it and gain wisdom, right? So, one of the first things you're going to notice is you're going to see dry matter percentage. And what that means is how much moisture was in that hay sample. Now, grass out on a pasture can be 70% moisture, meaning water content. Then the other 30% are all the nutrients, the sugars and all the fiber and protein and everything, right? In our hay, we're around 90% dry matter, only about 10% moisture on average. So there's not a lot of moisture in that hay because it has been cured. It had been cut and sun dried. It's not silage. We never feed silage to horses. I always talk to horse owners, especially down in this part of the world where silage is fed to horses. And I said, don't, because that moisture content, it ferments and then you can get microbes. And then all of a sudden, you could be feeding that and you can kill your horse with microtoxins. It's happened. Hundreds of horses. I think I talked about it in another podcast. I remember in Florida back in the day. I mean, hundreds of horses just dropped dead because they were feeding silage. So our good quality horse hays are going to be up to like 90% dry matter. It's going to vary a little bit. So that's what that's telling you, how much moisture is in that hay. Now, the next thing you're going to see is protein. And the value important for you is probably just crude protein percentage. And so what that means is the total protein content within that hay. Our grass hays very, you're looking at 8 to 10%, maybe 12% crude protein. Your legume hays, those go 15, 20, maybe above 22% crude protein. So if you feed a lot of alfalfa mixed in with some grass hay, there's going to be a lot more protein in that forage than just a grass hay. Like I said, we tend to overfeed protein. It's one of those nutrients that we thought, oh, horses need a lot of protein. And then we walk in their stalls and we get knocked over with the smell. Generally, horses around 10% crude protein, 10 to 12% crude protein. Again, depending on the horse, every horse is individual, is going to be okay. That's the range you're looking at. So, then when you look at the soluble protein, I mean, that's just different stuff that your nutritionist can look at. It's the soluble fraction of the protein that is readily available to the animal. It contains small amino acid chains and non-protein nitrogen. Again, for you just kind of look at that crude protein percentage, and that's going to give you a good idea of how much protein is in that hay. Your nutritionist, if you work with them, they could look at that a little bit and delve deeper into some of these other percentages. But again, for the general horse owner, that just, for me, that gets too much into the weeds of things and will make your head spin, because there's other things you really need to look at. So you look at, dry matter. Okay, that's around 90%. That's fine. Crude protein for grass hay around 10%, or legume hay 16, 18%. That's normal. Then you're going to have the fibers. Now, horses need a lot of fiber in the diet, right? Because it's important for digestive health. Then that fiber goes to the hindgut, because horses are hindgut fermenters. And the microbes in the hindgut convert that fiber to volatile fatty acids, which is critical for the horse, where they get a lot of energy. So the fiber part of the hay test is very important to look at. And it's representative really in two things. I mean, there's also lignin in there, but acid detergent fiber, neutral detergent fiber, and then the lignin. Now, really quick, lignin is the part of the forage that the horse can't digest or digest very, very little because the microorganisms in the hindgut have a really tough time breaking down lignin. So whatever lignin the horse eats generally goes out the hind end. There's really no digestion in it. Like if you feed them corn, don't, but I want to use horses as an example. When they eat corn, you tend to see the kernel come out the hind end. I mean, there is some digestion they get at the middle of that corn, but you tend to see that corn shell or coating that you see come out the horse. Some you see in oats too, like if you feed them oats and you see it in their feces, that's like lignin. That they can't digest it. So lignin will show you kind of the maturity of a hay. If there's too much lignin, that might mean that hay's too mature for the horse, and again could impact nutrients. But that's where this acid detergent fiber and that neutral detergent fiber comes in. The acid detergent fiber is the portion of cellulose and lignin. Okay, so cellulose, digestible by the horse, and the range that's good for the horse is 30 to 40%. That's the range of the ADF, the acid detergent fiber. If it's above 45%, probably means it's a more mature hay. It is probably too fibrous for the horse and not enough energy is being getting out of it. So that is where that 30 to 40% value, when you look at it, you look at your hay test and go, okay, that's where we want it. Neutral detergent fiber, again, another measurement to look at the quality of the hay. It has the lignin, cellulose, and hemicellulose. So hemicellulose is partially digestible by the horse. The cellulose is digestible and that lignin isn't. Again, the higher the NDF value, that means it's more fibrous, probably doesn't taste as well to the horse, not as palatable. And again, probably too much fiber, right? It's like eating straw. Horses, they can eat straw and it can be a strategy for like weight loss and things to feed horses some chopped straw, but that's a whole different discussion. But if you think about straw as a general forage for the horse, obviously there's not a lot of nutrients in there because it's very fibrous. NDF values you want to range 40 to 60%. So again, ADF 30 to 40%, NDF 40 to 60%, and anything over 65% means it's probably too fibrous, probably doesn't taste as good for the horse. They may not eat as much, so they're not getting those other nutrients. Okay, so that's the fibers. Non-fibers, you will see fat. Not a lot of fat in our forages, 1 to 3%. Horses do well on added fats to the diet. We know that. Again, they need time to adjust if you add fats to the diet. Again, anytime you make a dietary change, it's plug this here. You want to do it over a period of 2 to 3 weeks, right? You want to do it slowly. But fats are one of those things that a lot of research in the last 2 decades has shown is an excellent source of energy for the horse if they need it. But again, we tend to overfeed our horses, so not a lot of horses do. But those, especially those athletes, they could use some. Okay, so fat is low in our forages. The non-structural carbohydrates, however, okay, this is where it gets tricky. And let me explain. With your hay tests, you have to be careful with the NSC that they report because most laboratories, they're doing hay tests for ruminant animals, like I said, cattle, sheep. They report the NSC looking at water-soluble carbohydrates and the starch. For horse nutrition, because horses digest differently than our ruminants. They're hind gut fermenters, where the ruminants, it's their stomachs. The NSC is calculated with the ethanol soluble carbohydrate plus starch. That will be your NSC value for your horse. So again, when you get your hay test report back and there is a non-structural carbohydrates, because that's one thing we're really looking at today, we're feeding too many carbohydrates. It's leading to insulin resistance and all these other metabolic issues. And especially for our PSSM horses or other types of horses, where we have to be careful on the sugars and starches in our feeds. So again, in your hay test, you want to add the value, the ESC plus the starch. That will be your horse NSC. Now, some labs may, if it's horse specific, they'll do that for you, but just double check that. And again, this is probably, especially if you have a metabolic horse or you're worried about that, you need to be working with an equine nutritionist or a veterinarian that's schooled in equine nutrition. Okay, because they will look at that hay test and then they can help you decide if you need to source different hay, right? Or limit the amount of hay you're giving. Okay, so we went through dry matter, protein, the fibers, okay, the non-fibers, that fat, and then that NSC. Now let's look at the minerals. Again, can vary from lab to lab, but in general, they're going to report things like sodium. Now, sodium is low in our forages, but horses need more sodium, especially to support like exercise and sweating and all of that. So it's always advisable to provide, free choice salt to a horse or loose salt, in addition to adding salt to, say, your vitamin mineral mix if it doesn't have it in there or needs more. Always be aware of that. Also in the minerals, you'll see something called ash percentage. That's just because when they do the chemistry, right, the analytical chemistry, they burn that hay at a very high temperature, so it turns to ash. And that ash percentage is just kind of a representative that your nutritionist can look at, and it gives them an idea of the mineral content in that hay. Now, iron is probably a very large value. Most forages are just high in iron. They just are, and they're above what the horse needs each and every day. So you'll see that and go, okay, there's a lot of iron. Now you have to be careful feeding way too much iron. So again, that's something an equine nutritionist can look at the total diet of your horse and then make adjustments if needed. Now, two ratios you really should key in on, and that's the calcium phosphorus ratio. And you may have heard that before because it's so important, especially like in our growing horses. It's important for the bones and teeth. So, we have to make sure we maintain a proper balance. Now, the range for horses is 1.5 parts calcium to 1 part phosphorus, up to 4 parts calcium, 1 part phosphorus. So that means there needs to be more calcium than phosphorus in the hay. Remember, the horse is eating tons, not tons literally, but pounds or kilograms of hay every day. And so a lot of their minerals are coming from the hay. And any good horse vitamin mineral supplement is going to have a proper calcium phosphorus ratio. So you need to make sure that ratio is in line from that 1.5 to 1 to 4 to 1. Okay? Because especially when it comes to like growing horses, that's so critical. The other one is zinc to copper ratio. Very important for proteins and enzymes and other physiological functions in the horse, collagen, hooves, their coats and manes. So that ratio needs to be in proper balance. So the zinc to copper, ideally for horses, is 3 to 1 upwards to 4 to 1. So 3 parts zinc to 1 part copper, or 4 parts zinc to 1 part copper. So you want to check that too and make sure. And then if there's other minerals that they're looking at, just you want to look at to see if it is or it's devoid of it, right? Then the final thing you want to look at is the digestible energy. So again, we went through the dry matter, we went through the protein, we went through the fibers, very important for our horses. We looked at the carbohydrates, fat percentage, but those carbohydrates, those minerals, and then the overall energy or digestible energy of that hay. This is a key value, especially if you have an overweight horse and you are looking to lose weight, or if you have an underweight horse. And you look at your hay and you realize, wow, it's not as high in energy as I would hope. So maybe I need to supplement things like add an oil with beet pulp as a carrier, as an example. So around 2 megacows per kilogram, that's what we're looking for the value. Your nutrient dense hays are going to be above that. Your grass hays, if they're average or more mature, is going to be under that, like 1.8. So you want to look at that value and see if you're really feeding a nutrient dense hay or a older, more mature hay, right? And again, when you look at the fiber values too, that probably clue you in a little bit. Things that will be missing from almost all hay tests or most hay tests: vitamins, some of these trace minerals like selenium. They won't break down the amino acids like lysine or methionine, the biotin, other nutrients that horses might need. So you are going to know, okay, this hay test tells me a lot, but it doesn't give me everything. So again, that's why it's just a good vitamin mineral mix on top of the forage. Start from there and then either add things or limit hay if you have a weight issue. But again, this is where working with an equine nutritionist will really, really help you. Look at this hay test and give you guidance on how to adjust your horse's diet. If you want to learn more, you can go to Mad Barn, taking a hay sample for your horse and understanding the analysis. There's an article that follows up with this, explains it a little bit more detail, and some of these other things that you might get on there. Highly suggest you go check that article out because it will really help you, and especially when you do get your hay tested and you go and look, and it will help you look at some of those results. But information is power. I mean, it's so important to your horses, their overall health. Everything starts with diet. Everything starts with diet. And I know Dr. Lori Warren is probably saying, Chris, I told you so. Because I used to tell her all the money's in the hind end of the horse, reproduction and everything I was doing. And she said, no, it starts at the front end. It's what you feed them. And after these many years of working with her day in, day out, and then doing research with her side by side, and then going out in the world doing other things, I have to agree with her that nutrition it starts with everything. Everything. It's so important for your horses. So don't miss this opportunity to take this information and apply it to your animals. It's going to have a major impact on their health and well-being. That, again, information is power. And they always say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Because if we're feeding our horses right and they're not getting these imbalances, they have healthy coats, healthy hooves, healthy digestive tract, it's going to save you a lot more money in the end, especially with like vet bills and things like that. But it's going to improve the welfare of the horse and then in turn improve your life. So don't miss this opportunity to take and apply this information. So thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe and keep monitoring this YouTube channel. More stuff's coming your way very soon. Take care.